Welcome to Chapter 8, Intelligence and Academic Achievement. So while the theories of cognitive development that we looked at in last chapter tend to focus on universal processes that affect all children, the study of intelligence really focuses on individual differences and, what makes one person have a higher intelligence than another. So in this chapter, we will look at four main learning questions once again, and they are as follows. How do we define and measure intelligence? That will be looked at in this video, and this will be the kind of the longest video in this first one, and we'll cover about the first half of the chapter or so. And then some shorter videos will look at examples of cognitive deficits and intellectual gifts or variations, in intellectual ability. In the third video, we'll get to looking at academic achievement, and in the fourth video, we'll look at some group differences in academic achievement. So let's start off by looking at how we can define intelligence, and then we'll look at how we can assess it. And there certainly has been a lot of debate throughout the years, or throughout the decades, or even centuries, I would say, in how to define intelligence. Because it's not a simple definition. If to really capture what it is, it's not an easy definition, and you get quite a variety of definitions that show up of what intelligence actually is. So we're going to go with this Sternberg definition here. Fairly simple, but as it says, useful. The ability to adapt to the environment, to think and learn, and to understand oneself and others. It's not a bad definition. What you can see is not in this definition is the amount of knowledge you have. And that typically is not part of the definition of intelligence. So as defined in psychology, intelligence is not knowing a lot of facts or having a large vocabulary that you've learned over the years. It's about adapting here and now. Given a new problem that you have to solve, do you have the capacity to adapt and solve this new problem? And so we don't think of it as how much information you've stored, but how more about how quick on your feet you are. Can you solve a problem that's just come up? And anyways, some early research was done by a researcher named Spearman, and this was back in the early 1900s. And what he did was he gave subjects a whole barrage of different types of tests. So, there would be like math tests and vocabulary tests and, logic tests. And, anyways, he would give a whole bunch of different subjects and different types of tests and compare the results, how individuals did, on the various tests. And what he found was that people that, did really well on one test, would tend to do pretty well on the other tests as well. Like the scores correlated. So people that had high scores, on the first or second test, would also have high scores on the third and fourth test. And people that had low scores, on the first couple, on one or two tests, would tend to have lower scores on the other tests as well. So your scores kind of went together. People would, generally score high or low or in the middle, but the scores weren't all up and down. Like somebody wouldn't be like first on the math test, but last on the vocabulary test, And so what he proposed, because the scores correlated and the high scores went with other high scores and low scores with other low scores, he figured, well, there must be, one type of intelligence that causes this kind of pattern. If we had a separate intelligence for each ability, then you would expect that somebody might be really strong in one area and do really well on one test, but then be really weak on another area. And this is not what he found. He found that, like I said, high scores went with other high scores. And so he proposed that we have a single general intelligence, which he called G. And that this underscores all of our cognitive abilities. So you have like one main intelligence and so if your main intelligence is high, this is why you might perform very well on the whole series of tests. And if your G intelligence is low, you might score poorly on all of the tests. He also said, he did say that there was within this general intelligence, there were specific factors, and he called these S factors for specific, meaning that, like they would, lead to some variety in scores. So let's say I have a generally high general intelligence and I score well on, pretty well on all the tests, but, I do particularly well on math and not quite so well on, vocabulary, let's say. So maybe I have a specific factor, that helps my math abilities, and and I have a specific factor that maybe isn't so high for vocabulary. So there's one general intelligence that's going to cause me to have all high scores, but there'll be some variety between the scores because of these specific factors that just kind of might push a score, your normal score up or down, depending on whether your specific factor is high or low in that for that particular skill. Okay, so he was the first to kind of really research this idea that perhaps we have one general intelligence, and we really kind of accept this idea more or less now. I mean, we'll see later at the end of this video that there's been some proposals that we have more than one major type of intelligence, and so it's not agreed upon by everyone, but I would say the majority of psychologists, would agree that, that we do have a general intelligence. Okay. We can also define or split apart intelligence into two major types called fluid and crystallized intelligence. Fluid intelligence is, as it says here, how efficiently we can think and solve problems that are new to us. And this is, this kind of fits with the idea of adapting to the environment and to new situations and new problems. It's how good are you at adapting and solving new problems? Like, given that you have, let's say, no or limited background knowledge in that particular area, can you still solve a problem? So this is like intelligence that doesn't rely on how much knowledge you've gained over the years. Whereas crystallized intelligence is that set of knowledge you have. So what you already know, and you can you can certainly use it to solve problems. It's your accumulation of knowledge throughout your life. And it's kind of like your storehouse of knowledge. So when I talked about somebody that might know a lot of facts or have a really large vocabulary, we would say that they're high in crystallized intelligence. But it doesn't necessarily mean that they're good problem solvers, because fluid intelligence is somewhat different. So even though like there's one generalized intelligence that we can still kind of split it apart into a couple of different aspects. Um, and but the definition we looked at captures more the idea of fluid intelligence, which is adapting to new problems and new environments. Okay. Anyways, let's look at a little bit at the history of intelligence testing. And as this is here, one of the first attempts was made by Binet, and along with a research partner that doesn't get as much credit, Simon. So it was Binet and Simon, a couple of French psychologists, and they were asked early 1900 to develop a test that would determine which children would benefit more from schooling and which ones, would not benefit from schooling. The reason why this was important at that time was it was right around the turn of the century, late 1800s going into the early 1900s, that laws were started to be passed that children had to attend school up to a certain age. Before that, there was children that would just drop out of school at a young age and then, actually go and start working at a very young age. There's back in the days of child labor, sometimes working in horrible conditions in mines and things like that. But what prompted these laws that the children would have to attend school is that we entered into the Industrial Revolution, and all of a sudden it became important for society to become better educated. We needed people to create these new machines and to know how to use them and fix them, and this required some general intelligence. So it was really the industrialized revolution that pushed the society to making children stay in school longer and into their adolescence. And anyways, okay, going a little bit off track there, but so that was the reasoning why the French government, they asked Binet, now all of a sudden they had all these kids in school that weren't necessarily all there before now, but because of the new laws, and they would just group them all together, and some of them were learning well, some of them weren't, and they wanted to figure out a way to maybe split them up, who can really benefit from schooling and who can't. And so they devised the very first intelligence test, Binet and Simon, known as the 1905 scales, because it came out in 1905, often just called the Binet test. When Binet developed this first intelligence test, his goal was to measure a child's performance on tasks similar to those required in school, and then compare the child's performance to the performance of others of the same age. So like you do a bunch of 10-year-olds and 11-year-olds and 12-year-olds and 5-year-olds, whatever, and you would compare each child's result to others of a similar age or the same age. And he developed the concept of mental age, which is what age is a child thinking at. So let's say like a 10-year-old, scored very similarly to the average 11-year-old. So that 10-year-old would be said to have a mental age of 11 because he's performing like most 11-year-olds. Okay. And a little bit later, Louis Terman, he standardized Binet's test and revised it and translated it and brought it to the U.S. And Terman was at Stanford University, and this new test became known as the Stanford Binet test, which is still around today. Stanford University does all of the revisions on it, and this was back in 1916 that Terman introduced the revised Stanford Binet test. And Louis Terman was also the one that created the intelligent quotient, which was, he created a formula to come up with one number intelligence. The first formula for this was mental age divided by chronological age, or MA over CA, mental age over chronological age, and then you times it by 100. So when I talked about that 10-year-old that had a mental age of 11 because he performed like 11-year-olds, so you would take his mental age 11 divided by 10, his actual chronological age, and you times it by 100, you would end up with 110. And so that would be the child's IQ. So this first formula, suggested that it worked out that IQ would have an average or a mean of about 100, because if your mental age is the same as your chronological age, so like you're an average 10-year-old, you think like a 10-year-old, you're actually 10 years old, it would be 10 over 10 times 100, you would end up with 100. So that kind of 100 represented the average, that you're thinking at the appropriate level for your age. If you're above 100, it means you're advanced. If you're below 100, you're behind your age in thinking. Okay. That was 1916, and then in 1939, David Wechsler made a new intelligence test called the Wechsler Intelligence Scale for Children, or the WISC, and he introduced the concept of deviation IQ. And it was based on what Terman had done, but the idea was that you would administer the test to a very large sample of people, at all different ages, and you would establish norms for each age, and you would set the mean to be 100, as shown in this graph here, and the standard deviation to be 15, and you come up with this normal curve that would represent the population of intelligence scores in a large population. And so the idea of the deviation IQ is that an individual score on an IQ test would indicate how much that individual score deviates from the average score of others of the same age. And the importance of this from what Terman did, Terman said it was mental age over chronological age, but once you start giving intelligence tests to adults, that idea doesn't really make a lot of sense anymore. It was fine to say, hey, that 10-year-old thinks like an 11-year-old, so he's got 110 IQ, but suppose I'm 55 and I take a test and I'm above, I have above average IQ, like, does it make sense to say he's a 55-year-old but he thinks like a 60-year-old? Well, is that good or bad? I mean, so once you get past childhood ages, I mean, the idea of doing basing it on mental age over chronological age doesn't really make sense anymore. So this is why, we've adopted this idea of the deviation IQ. Every IQ test is set with a mean of 100. We expect that to be the average for any large group, and the standard deviation of 15. And once you have an IQ score, then you can, because we know the properties of this normal curve shown here, you can precisely say how much of the population somebody is ahead of or behind. We know exactly what percentage of the population will have IQs between 115 and 130, for instance. And we know that it'll be about 2%, for instance, of the population with IQs above 130 or below 70. I mean, this normal curve really represents a large population. So for instance, I say, every adult in the United States was to take an IQ test. I mean, it would form, and if you graphed all the scores, it would form a curve like this. Of intelligence tests. Right, the two most popular tests right now are the Stanford-Binet and the Wechsler intelligence tests. Besides this intelligence test for children, scale for children, there's also, Wechsler also has an adult scale, and just similarly, the Stanford-Binet has a test for adults as well as one for children. And one thing that's nice about the Wechsler intelligence scale is that it has a number of subscales, and so rather than just ending up with a final IQ score, you can actually get values for each of these types of subscales, like arithmetic, vocabulary, block design, digit span, etc. And so you can see like where somebody is stronger or weaker, and rather than just looking at one final score. So people really do like this intelligence scale for children. Okay. And the Wechsler scale, as well as the Stanford-Binet, they're both examples of what we call standardized tests. Most intelligence tests are standardized tests. And that all it means is when you say it's a standardized test is that it's administered and scored in a standard or consistent way, to all people that take the test. So if you take a Stanford-Binet test, in New York, you'll be in the same conditions as somebody that takes it in Florida. I mean, as far as how much time you get, and what the instructions are, etc. So standardized tests is to make sure that everyone that takes it under similar conditions, and that way we can compare the scores, right? So it's not, it wouldn't make sense if New York was given a different set of rules, for their IQ tests than for Florida. I mean, there'd be no way to compare the scores though. And then, so this is the value of standardized tests, is that everyone that takes it under similar conditions, and you can then make meaningful comparisons and end up with a large database of scores. There are a number of criticisms, though, of standardized IQ tests. There's been many criticisms about certain biases that are built into the tests. For instance, language issues. A person may not do well on an IQ test just because their vocabulary is not as good and they don't understand some of the instructions or some of the particular words on the test. Particularly when you think about cases of somebody whose first language is different from what the test is in. So let's say somebody's immigrated to the United States and learned English. I mean, they may have particular language issues that gives them a poor score, even though they may be very intelligent. So there's been a lot of incidents of biases that have been included in tests. And as one psychologist once put it, I mean, basically IQ tests are developed by white males in the U.S. for other white males, and that anyone else is the tests are kind of biased against. Anyway, that was from a long time ago, but tests have gotten better. But it's also been said by I'm just going to backtrack for 1 second, just to go back to his name, Sternberg, the one that came up with this first definition that I showed you. He has pointed out that he doesn't believe that any IQ tests exist that are not biased in one way or another. He believes that it's impossible to create an unbiased test. Okay, so that's one criticism. The tests have biases towards certain groups of people in particular. Another criticism is that there are other influences that are going to affect IQ scores besides intelligence. So just as an example, how a child is feeling when they take a test. If a child's not feeling well or they're sick or something and they still have to take an IQ test, of course it could impact their performance. Motivation has been pointed out. How some children just don't do well because they don't really care about the test and they don't really try that hard. Testing conditions, even though it's supposed to be standardized, there are cases where some children will take the test in a very noisy room or a disruptive classroom, whereas other ones are in a very quiet lecture hall and where they have ideal conditions to think and take the test. So there are certainly factors that aren't going to affect the final score beyond intelligence. And this is what people have been critical of. We should not put too much merit into this one score that we arrive at in an intelligence test. In response to some of these criticisms, there have been new types of standardized testing devised. One is called dynamic assessment. And this is kind of based on Vygotsky's ideas a little bit. Remember, with Vygotsky, we had the zone of proximal development, and this was like what a child could do with assistance, from a more experienced adult or peer. And this is the idea of dynamic assessment, that you measure a child's potential for change, like when an examiner is present and will assist and help the child over certain hurdles. And the idea is to see like what can they learn very quickly if you eliminate some of their hurdles. So just as a simple example, if a child doesn't know what one of the instructions means or what one of the words means, the examiner can certainly let them know what a word means, and so that they're not performing poorly because they don't understand the question. So the examiner will kind of step in and help the child and actually maybe even teach them certain concepts that they're unaware of. And then the idea is that you assist the child somewhat, and then you see, can they pick up on this new learning? Like, how can they do after they've received some assistance? And so the examiner's not trying to get the child a high score or anything. It's not like that, but they will help them learn some simple concepts that the child may be unaware of, that maybe were never taught to the child, help with vocabulary, things like that. And you see, like, with assistance, how much can this child show? And so it's very much based on, once again, Vygotsky's idea of what a child can do with assistance from another. And so this will eliminate some of the issues of, if the test is biased against certain people, then the examiner will help, smooth out some of those biases by helping the child, overcome some of the hurdles. Anyways, that's one type of test. So that's not a standardized test because it's a one-on-one test with an examiner present. It's much more comprehensive, interview style test where, one-on-one kind of test where you get a really, with a qualified examiner, you'll get a really good assessment of the child's intelligence level. Excuse me. Authentic assessment is another type of test that's been developed, and this one focuses on the process used in solving complex real-life problems. So this one's about, let's take it out of the kinds of artificial problems that are normally on IQ tests and give like real-life practical kinds of problems. So with a child, maybe you say, I don't know, it could be something as simple as like you want to bake a cake for your mother's birthday. I don't know, what are all the steps you would have to go through, and to see if the young child knows about that. They would have to get a recipe and follow the steps, and then maybe go grocery shopping to buy some of the ingredients they need. I mean, like, I don't know if that's a good example, but that's the kind of thing that they do. It's like a real life issue that you know, how would you go about solving this? And you see if they can come up with a set of logical steps to solve a real world problem. Okay. When we test infants for intelligence, it's obviously a very difficult process. They cannot understand test instructions. You can't give them a standardized test. They cannot provide verbal responses. So, I mean, you have to be more creative in assessing an infant's intelligence. As it says here, most tests assess physical, motor, sensory, and or early language development. Just kind of like, you know, basic skills that an infant should be learning. You know, with newer techniques developed by information processing, though, the tests have been expanded to look at some very important processes, like an infant's memory. I talked about infant memory in the last chapter, and you know, we have ways to test infants' memories. You know, with you know, if you remember, you could test an infant to see if they could remember how to kick their leg to make a mobile move. So we already, like in the first year of life, we can test memory. Processing speed is important. Remember, that's a very important concept in information processing, and there are ways now to assess an infant's processing speed, meaning the speed of their nervous system. They also test the ability of an infant to pay attention to new stimuli, as well as their ability to habituate to familiar ones. Habituating, remember, it means that you get used to it. And so they'll see how long it takes an infant to get used to a stimulus that's being presented over and over again. One other thing they test is emotion regulation. And the reason they test these things, memory, processing speed, paying attention to new stimuli, habituating to old ones, emotional regulation, research shows that all of these things help infants learn from their environment. And that makes sense. If they have better memory, they'll learn more. If they can pay attention to new stimuli, you know, better, and they have better sustained and selective attention, they'll learn more from the environment. If they can regulate their emotions, you know, so that they're not like getting distracted with their emotions, they'll do better at learning. So it's turned out that this new information processing approach of studying things like memory and processing speed it's really paid off in being able to more accurately assess intelligence from a very early age. Okay. The nature-nurture controversy and intelligence. So nature nurturing, you know, we've talked about this before, genes versus environment. And if we go back to the 1920s, there was what's called the eugenics movement, was really kind of ramping up then. And eugenics has to do with, as it says here, breeding better human beings. So the idea was, you know, like, well, now that we know how genes work, you know, like if we put two smart people together and they have babies, these babies, you know, these children should be even smarter. Like, you know, if you put two athletes together, they should have athletically gifted children. And so the idea was, you know, maybe we could do some selective breeding and create better humans and that are you know, more athletic and smarter and so this eugenics movement basically ended with the horrors committed by the Nazis in World War II, because what they did was really in the name of eugenics. That was Hitler's driving force. He wanted to create a pure and advanced race by having Germans breed with other Germans, and that and he wanted to get rid of bad genes, which to him was the Jewish genes and the gypsy genes and the homosexual genes. And this idea was his driving force, was to create a superior race, and which led to all the atrocities that happened. So when when we kind of saw eugenics being played out by Hitler and the Nazis, I mean, no one really wanted to talk about eugenics anymore after that. It became really a dead subject that, we can't really, systematically try to create better humans and decide who breeds with who and things like that. Then and so that was the idea of, that was a belief certainly in nature. Just to make sure that's clear, that it was all about, putting certain genes together, and with the thought that intelligence and abilities are caused by genes. This came up again, this focus on nature, on genetics, in the Herrnstein and Murray 1994 book, The Bell Curve, and it was quite a controversy, I will tell you, because they made the point in the book that IQ is inherited and unchangeable, that there are permanent differences, they said, among races, for instance, permanent differences in their genes, meaning that, like African Americans, like as a whole race of people, like have somewhat inferior genes to white Caucasians, and at least in the U.S. And this is why we see differences in IQ scores. So they kind of pushed the idea that the different races had different intellectual abilities built into their genes, into their genetics. So this was very, very controversial, obviously. And so the American Psychological Association set up a task force to conduct research on this issue and to arrive at well-researched conclusions. And what they concluded was that intelligence was mainly affected by environment, and that the differences we see, the racial differences that we see, were caused by environmental differences, not by genetic differences. Okay. It turns out, like, based on that research and other research into intelligence, we know that intelligence is not very deeply canalized. Canalization refers to how much certain abilities or behaviors or things like that are kind of just set in stone by your genes. So just to give you an example, something like a human's ability to talk is very deeply canalized. Being deeply canalized means that we don't really have to do too much teaching. A baby just learns to talk because it's in their genes. Once they are exposed to language, they learn to talk. As long as they don't have any major, deficits or, then basically every baby learns to talk. And something like walking, a baby learning to walk, that's a deeply canalized behavior, meaning that it's not like just some children learn to walk, some don't. I mean, every child that's normally, that has, once again, no physical deficits. I mean, they learn to walk because it's built into our genes. So, you don't have to be taught to talk. You don't have to be taught to walk. You just learn it. So that's called canalization. So the more something is canalized, the more it just relies on our genes and our biology. So as I start off to saying here, we found out that intelligence is not very deeply canalized. So what that means is that whatever the genetic starting point, the environment will have a substantial impact on intelligence. So it doesn't mean that genetics don't do anything. I mean, there is still a genetic contribution to intelligence, but we know that the environment is once again has a substantial impact on the intelligence that a child ends up with, or an adult ends up with. A couple of pieces of evidence pointing to the importance of nurture, the environment. One is the Flynn effect. Excuse me. And this is an interesting effect, and it's been shown in statistics from many countries that IQs have increased generation by generation over the last 100 years or so. We have data from over 100 years ago where we've kept track of intelligence scores as a society, and like I said, there was a number of countries that have done this, and what you see is when you look at the intelligence scores, I mean, they've gone up steadily for the last 100 years, meaning that you guys are on average somewhat smarter than your parents' generation, and your parents' generation was somewhat smarter than your grandparents' generation. And you may think, well, could this be genetics? Maybe evolution. As a race, we're getting smarter. Well, evolution doesn't work generation by generation like that, especially with the magnitude of the differences that we've seen. Like, it's something like, I don't know, IQs go up something like 3 points every 10 years or so. I mean, which is substantial. Something like genetics might cause an increase in the whole human race to have, go up 1 point in 1,000 years or something. I mean, like, seriously, it's evolution's a much slower process. So over 100-year period, there's IQs have just, steadily climbed. And this is the only way to explain it is environmental influences. Each generation over the last 100 years has been healthier overall compared to the previous generation. We've improved our nutrition. And so we start out, in life as children, like overall eating better and eating more nutritious food. This helps our brain development. We have less illness because of our medical advances, and we've eliminated a lot of childhood diseases, and so we are, as we become healthier and eat more nutritious, and this has led to more optimal maturation of our brains, meaning that we're reaching our full potential. We're more likely to reach our full potential, at least under ideal conditions. But we have a lot more chance of doing it now. Like, we have a lot more ideal conditions than we did 100 years ago, obviously. And so, besides the medical advances and then getting rid of diseases and better nutrition, we've also just improved learning, and this helps with IQ. I mean, things like what you're looking at now. I mean, technology, with the phones and the computers and everything. I mean, like, people learn quicker now. This has helped to advance IQ because starting from when we're young children, we have better learning methods to stimulate our brains. So once again, it helps us to reach our potentials. Okay, so this Flynn effect just shows that the environment has a substantial impact on IQ scores, and it can affect all of society, like from one generation to the next. A second piece of evidence is they found that when children that are adopted from poverty type situations into, let's say middle class loving families, they've shown that their IQs increase by about 12 points, which is quite a leap. 12 points IQ is a substantial increase. And how do we know that they increase? Well, they compare children that get adopted to some that do not get adopted and that continue to grow up in those, poverty type situations. And when you compare the children that grow up in better environments, in middle class families with better education and better stimulation of their brains, I mean, they end up 12 points higher. So this shows that just changing environments, increases IQ. And it also kind of shows us how much growing up in poverty hurts IQs. I mean, like, it's costing children, a lot of IQ points to grow up in poor surroundings and in poor environments. Anyways, okay, let me go on. So the bottom line here is that we know that genetics do play some role in intelligence. They kind of provide a starting point, but environment then really has a great influence. And optimal environments will kind of allow you to optimize your genetics and reach your potential. Substandard environments will lower your potential for IQ, for intelligence. Neuroscience and intelligence. So let me just read what's here first. Differences in the brain between people with high and low intelligence may be programmed by genes, or they may result from life experiences, or they may be an interaction of both. So, as I've already been saying, we know that genes are important, nature, we know that nurture is important, life experiences, and we also know that they interact. So they all help to determine the overall, kind of an overall IQ that somebody ends up with. In particular, research has shown that your early years of life are incredibly important. In neuroscience research, they've shown that an increase in myelination. Remember, myelination is when your neurons get a fatty substance surrounding the axons that speeds up processing in the brain. Well, when there's an increase in myelination early in childhood, and this is by the age of 3, so first few years of life, it results in higher IQ scores. And they say this is because the neural networks get strengthened with this myelination, and this supports later intellectual development. So, if we take a scan and see how much, a 3-year-old's brain is myelinated, how much myelin they have on the neurons, and you can see this in a brain scan by comparing the amount of white versus gray matter. Myelination shows up as white matter in the brain. So already by the age 3, we can tell whether a child is more likely to develop a higher IQ, because the myelinated brain means that they'll have faster processing, means that they'll have better chance for greater intellectual development. So this tells us, these first few years of life, and this takes us back to that first chapter. I talked a lot about the importance of the developing years, the first few years of life. We watched a couple of videos that showed that how much trauma can affect brain development. And so this kind of takes us back to that point. Those first few years of life, if they are substandard, if a child experiences trauma, or they, improper nutrition, or just a lack of stimulation in the first few years of life, their brain is already going to be substandard by the age of 3, and this is going to interfere with their intellectual development. Okay, let's go on. IQ scores and academic achievement. Um, so IQ scores may do a relatively good job of predicting academic achievement for some children. I mean, there is certainly correlation. People with higher IQs tend to do better in school. But even IQ scores between individuals. So that means that there's certainly other factors involved. Test-taking motivation, self-control are a couple of the ones that have been pointed out. And so one of the things that they have researched is test-taking motivation. And in a study that was kind of looking at intrinsic versus extrinsic motivation. Intrinsic means internal motivation. Extrinsic motivation is reward-based. What they did in the study is they tested subjects by giving them an IQ test, and then they changed the conditions and at a later time they offered them a monetary incentive for doing well on the IQ test. So if you do well, you'll get some money out of it. And what they found was that scores increased overall. So when basically if the children were more motivated because there was money involved, they did better on the test. So this just showed, the importance of motivation for IQ scores. And in that condition, the lower scores increased the most because the people that were scoring lowest, one of the reasons they were scoring the lowest was they just lacked motivation. And so they showed greater increase when there was something to gain by doing well on the test. They showed similar results if they offered an A grade to the top 3 students. So you would have a class of students, if they said, okay, whoever scored the top 3 on this IQ test automatically get an A in the course. This improved the whole class's performance. Also, if they just offered some other kind of prize, it didn't have to be money, it didn't have to be an A. They did various conditions of offering it like a prize. Then they did a condition just offering a certificate for good performance. So if you did well, you would get a certificate. This improved class performance as well. So this just showed that if you give some kind of external motivation, that it will improve test scores, and the children will try harder. The one thing that didn't work was just saying we'll give you a letter grade between A and F, which is what schools typically give, right? So that is the one thing that did not motivate students. It's like, oh, if I do better, I might get an A, or I might move up from a C to a B. It was giving a letter grade just didn't do anything to motivate them. But if there was a prize or a certificate or some money, then they were motivated. Okay. And so anyways, once again, we can't always trust IQ scores because of these other factors, such as motivation. Okay, on these last couple of slides here, I mentioned earlier that there was some researchers that have proposed that perhaps, Spearman was wrong. We don't just have one general intelligence, but we have multiple intelligences. So we'll look at 2 theories now. And the first one is Gardner's theory of multiple intelligences. In his original theory, he proposed that we have 8 different types of intelligence. He called them frames of mind. 8 frames of mind was the title of his major paper when he presented this. But if you count these up, you'll see that there are 9 now. He's added one since his original work was published. I think it's the last one, existential, was added. This is a chart from your book, and it goes over what each intelligence refers to. So I'm not going to do it. You can look at this list. I could ask you about these on the test. And it also shows possible careers, like if you're strong in a particular type of intelligence, what kind of career might that lead you towards? And so, so these should make sense. If you're linguistically strong, you might be a public speaker or a writer, if you have good naturalist intelligence, you might be a weather forecaster or a park ranger doing something in nature, or maybe like a gardener or a biologist, would make sense too. Anyways, so what he said is these are independent intelligences. This list of 9 intelligences, that they're all separate from one another. And, everyone has all 9, but you can be high or low in different ones. The support that, or at least one type of support that Gardner offered, was that he pointed out that there are cases where an individual, an adult individual who suffers a brain injury, they may have some abilities that get severely impaired, while other abilities are largely unaffected. So an example would be, let's say, one example he used was there was a musician who had a brain injury and he lost the ability to speak. So that would be like a linguistic intelligence. He couldn't speak anymore, but he could still play music perfectly well, which would be, the musical ability, intelligence. So he said, this is evidence that these are separate intelligences. I mean, one gets severely affected, but the other one not at all. Okay. I would say the majority of psychologists don't necessarily buy into this idea that we have these specific 9 intelligences, but it was important theory to get psychologists thinking about other types of intelligence. And this was another theory then that came out about multiple intelligences, and this comes from Sternberg. We've already seen his name. He had that definition at the start of the chapter, and he proposes that we have 3 major types of intelligence. So it's called the triarchic theory. And he says that we have an analytical intelligence, and he says this is what Spearman was basically referring to with the concept of G. And he says this is what's closest to the type of intelligence that's valued in schools and is tested for in schools. So like his point was that basically all the stuff we do in schools, as well as what we do on IQ tests, they're all measuring analytical intelligence. And it's kind of like, it's like logical abilities and things like that. He says what we don't test for or promote in schools are these other 2 types: creative intelligence, being able to generate ideas and to deal successfully with novelty, and practical intelligence, using abilities to solve everyday problems. He proposes that, these are 2 other types of intelligence. We don't really recognize them, like I said, in schools, but he thinks that these other intelligences may explain why some people really do horribly in school and yet do great in life. So there are people that end up being high school dropouts, or they just can't get through school, and then they go on to form businesses and become very successful. And there's been multiple examples of people like that. And he would say that this is because of these other intelligences. If you have really good practical and creative intelligence, you can do a lot in life, even though you may not be good in school. And so everyone has these 3, and once again, to different levels. Okay. And once again, just to wrap this video up, these last couple of theories, once again, most psychologists don't buy into them specifically, but since they came out, there's been a lot more research and thinking about alternative intelligences. And one of the latest ones that's been studied a lot is called emotional intelligence, which makes some sense to me. It's not something that would be, again, like really tested in school, but people that are really good at interpreting emotions in others and dealing with emotions in others. I mean, this would be a very good skill in life and would really help them adapt to a lot of situations when they're good at, getting along and interpreting other people and helping others. And so that's been researched a lot more recently. So we've opened up the idea of alternative intelligences. Okay. And that will conclude the first video.